Hello, I'm LegenTerry and this is Starfield, the space-themed RPG shooter developed and published by Bethesda.
This is where we belong.
Can I just say, what an insane year for video games. There are at least a dozen contenders for the coveted title of Game of the Year that I can think of, and there are still more big releases on the horizon. I feel like a lot of us, self-included, saw one or two titles coming down the pipeline at the beginning of the year and started counting chickens before they hatched. And then we all got surprised. I mean, who really saw Baldur's Gate 3 swooping into almost perfect reviews and Armored Core 6 grabbing the mass market? Like, who saw Sea of Stars selling 100,000 copies on its first day and amassing over 2 million players across subscriptions? I guess what I'm getting at is that a lot of people's most anticipated game of 2023 has been Starfield ever since it was announced. Bethesda's history of making games in the Elder Scrolls and Fallout universes is a lengthy one, and everyone knows that Bethesda games are absolutely massive with tons of immersive ways to play. And with Starfield being their first brand new IP in 25 years, it has a very heavy crown to bear. Admittedly, I haven't been very excited about Starfield, mostly because of the way Bethesda obscured what we would be doing in the main story. A lot of cool artwork and some interesting gameplay systems were detailed, but for the most part, we only had a vague idea of why we would actually be going on this grand space adventure. In my opinion, it really felt like it was being marketed solely on the idea of exploring big open planets to shoot alien creatures and the merit of Bethesda Studios' past work alone. Now, I'm sure by this point in the video, someone out there already has something to say about my lack of excitement for the game, which means I need to address certain groups of people. Discourse surrounding Starfield has already peaked on the internet, and there are a lot of individuals that believe you can only fall into one of two camps, the haters or the shills. I'll say this once, if you're looking for my content to fan the flames of some imaginary console war that you've convinced yourself is real, or if you're afraid of hearing someone say that your new obsession isn't perfect, you can shut the video off now. I am not interested in your bullshit. Okay, rant against weird fanboys over. Everyone else, let's continue. Now, there's a lot going on with this game that's worth talking about, and a lot of that is probably going to come off negatively. That's just the nature of constructive criticism. If you want things changed for the better, you have to make sure that the developers understand what you don't like and why you don't like it. I will offer praise when it's due, and there is quite a bit of good in this game, but try not to take anything personally. You're still allowed to like what you like. The whole point of this video is to tell you about my experience with Starfield so far and letting you choose for yourself whether or not the game is worth your time and money. The entire premise of Starfield's narrative hinges on a singular great mystery that the characters in the game are trying to solve. As tradition goes with Bethesda games, your character is essentially a blank slate. You're a relatively new employee for a mining colony that digs for raw resources on other planets. When your supervisor asks you to investigate something that's giving off unnatural gravitational readings inside a newly discovered cave system, you find some kind of artifact made of an unknown metal sticking out of the rocks. You touch it and your mind is flung through a series of beautiful and confusing imagery and auditory sensations. And yes, jokes about tripping out on magic space rocks is mandatory. When you regain consciousness, your supervisor and your coworkers say they found you passed out next to the artifact, which doesn't seem to be affecting them. After a while in character customization, you walk out of the mineshaft and meet Barrett, the benefactor behind the dig. It turns out he works for an explorers group named Constellation, and he had the same experience with a similar artifact found on another planet. You can think of these guys as NASA meets Indiana Jones. Unfortunately, he's been tailed by pirates of the Crimson Fleet, so after a brief combat encounter, he lets you borrow his ship and bring the artifact to the other members of Constellation while he cleans up his mess. I'm not going to sugarcoat this. The plot takes a while to really get going because there's not a huge narrative hook to reel you in. The cutscene that you see through the eyes of your character touching the artifact gives you zero information about the direction the story is headed in, other than the possibility of an ancient intelligence plan to get there. And that's a pretty well-tread plot for sci-fi stories already. I'm going to take a short detour here to tell you that the game was frustrating to play. Not because of the content necessarily, but because of problems with the game crashing over and over. Hopefully this isn't an experience that most people will share, but I've read through several posts across social media and Reddit from people dealing with the same issue. As of writing, Bethesda has not yet publicly acknowledged this as a problem, but it's definitely a thing by their own admission in response to my email. This is happening on Series X, and it's been intermittent, happening anywhere from 15 minutes of playtime up to an hour between crashes, and some people have had it even worse. It's so frequent that I reached out to Bethesda's customer service. My time playing the game has been inexcusably marred by this problem, and I have lost a lot of progress between autosaves, needing to replay sections multiple times over. At this point, the response has basically been a nothing burger of an apology with no action taken, instead asking me to report my problems to Microsoft. It would be nice if they at least refunded the premium edition upgrade price, since I could barely play during the early access period, the sole reason I paid for it, but I'm not holding my breath. I just felt it was important to mention this as a bit of a warning for those who want to buy the game on console. I tried to not let it color my opinions on the game itself, and this is the last time I'll speak about the crashing problem, but it's truly awful. In my footage notes, I recorded a total of 34 crashes across my entire playthrough, and I'm pretty sure I left out a few after I got tired of counting. If you already have access to Game Pass, I would definitely try playing it that way instead of purchasing it to see if it happens to you, until they make some kind of patch to address the issue. Anyways, back to the content. Character creation, which I skimmed over, is about as good as you would expect from a Bethesda RPG. Not exactly say Skyrim levels of customization since everyone is a human, but there's a decent amount of knobs to turn. I would have liked to see a few extra hairstyles, or the inclusion of eyewear, or the ability to hide facial hair while adjusting parameters of your character's face, but it's serviceable. Bethesda's in-house engine that the game runs on has been updated to the Creation Engine 2, which has received some very big overhauls in fidelity, lighting, and performance, but those noticeable visual boosts come with a price. As many of you know, Starfield is an Xbox console exclusive. Director Todd Howard got out in front of the game's release to make sure we knew that it would run at 4K resolution and 30 FPS on the Series X, and 1440p at 30 FPS on the Series S. As Todd puts it in his own words, quote, "I think it'll come as no surprise given our previous games what we go for. Always these huge open worlds, fully dynamic, hyper detail where anything can happen. And we do want to do that. It's 4K in the X, it's 1440 on the S. We do lock it at 30 because we want that fidelity, we want all of that stuff. We don't want to sacrifice any of it. Fortunately in this one, we've got it running great. It's often running way above that, sometimes at 60. But on the consoles, we do lock it because we prefer the consistency where you're not even thinking about it." While I can really appreciate the way that the game looks, which I'll get back to soon, I promise, this quote is something I couldn't get out of my head, specifically the bit towards the end. Todd knows that the game could run at higher frame rates, but he elected to make the decision for us, the players, rather than giving us the tools to change it in a way that's comfortable for us to play. I'm sure that the game would feel even more consistent at 1080p and 60 FPS, but you won't be allowed to try that unless you're on a PC. In a world where it's become more and more common for modern console games to come packaged with a choice between fidelity and performance modes, I'm not a big fan of that choice being taken away just to stroke the director's ego. With the dirty laundry thoroughly aired out, yes, the game indeed looks nice. Specifically, textures on clothing and objects look spectacular up close, and the lighting is extremely detailed. It's using cube map reflections rather than ray tracing, but you'd be hard pressed to tell the difference in most cases. There's also a pretty heavy film grain effect that's turned on by default, but this is one of the rare cases where I'd say that it works well. With it turned off, the visual identity of the game becomes a bit too sterile and loses some of that cinematic quality in my opinion. Large settlements on the planets, like the cities of New Atlantis and Neon, are decorated beautifully, and it makes it feel like you're passing through an architect's paradise for futuristic concept designs. All of the areas like camps, laboratories, and star stations that you'll find while traveling the cosmos are littered with junk for you to sift through and hidden treasures to find. Shout out to the artists and the modelers who spent years coming up with hundreds of teeny tiny, nearly worthless items that cover every inch of the game just to make players who hoard things happy. And trust me, that's a lot of people who play RPGs like this. Planets and planetary bodies outside the ones you visit along the major quest lines feel a little more sparse in their details. A vast majority of these were created using procedural generation, with parameters set according to their actual locations in space relative to their stars, and maybe a few fudge numbers to make the existence of life actually possible. Most of them are just empty wastelands for you to perform scans on wildlife for experience points or harvest resources from. Honestly, I've only visited a few of these because there's really not a reason to unless you're desperate for a certain mineral or you're seeking out alien creatures that you haven't encountered before, or if you just want to find the coolest place for a photo op while you're taking a break from the normal gameplay loop. And while you're taking a break, why not like this video and subscribe? The creature designs for alien life are pretty cool with any amount of variance in size and shapes. You never know what to expect when you land in a new place. There might be creepy, aggressive bug monsters that come up to your torso, or massive herbivores that startle at the first sign of motion. I'm definitely looking forward to hunting down some of the more fun and exotic creatures in my downtime after finishing the main story. Animations for all human characters and fauna have become much more realistic and believable over the last couple of games, and you can play pretty comfortably in either first or third person without too many hiccups. I mostly preferred playing in first person for shooting, and because I also found it to be more accurate for looting items. The third person camera angles also tend to get a little bit too cramped in tight areas, leaving the game feeling much more claustrophobic than necessary. But when you're out in the open or dogfighting with other ships in space, it's worth swapping to for the added awareness. One thing that hasn't really improved is most of the facial animations. The intro of the game treats you to a pretty nice moment similar to the ones found in Cyberpunk 2077. One character is talking to you while simultaneously speaking to someone else in the scene as they move around and do things in the background. It's a really cool and natural feeling way of doing conversations that I still don't see CDPR getting enough credit for, but this is the exception in Starfield and not the rule by a long shot. If you've ever played a Bethesda game in your lifetime, you know exactly where this is going. Every time you start a dialogue with someone, the camera snaps in instantly and locks onto their face. I know people are still somehow nostalgic for this thing that they've done in every game for the last 20 years, but man, I wish Bethesda would step out of their comfort zone and build a camera system with some kind of dynamic movement and different angles. There's a reason why most film directors don't use static shots of their actors staring directly into the lens. It feels so rigid and unnatural, and it only highlights how awkward most of these robotic NPCs' faces look when they're in motion. Even when the conversation includes more than one person, the camera just cuts back and forth between the characters who sometimes happen to be staring at you rather than each other for some reason. Or worse, you're left staring at the back of their head while they speak. There are only a handful of characters who look like they may have had actual face and mocap work done for their performances, but almost everyone gets the old AI lip sync treatment. When it's actually working properly anyways.
Hopefully Neon treats you well.
The majority of your playtime will be spent in dialogue, and in my opinion, evolving beyond this mess should have been at the top of Bethesda's priority list. Let's jump back into the good side of things. There are tons of different styles of guns and melee weapons to use, some having aesthetics that match the environments and the cultures that they hail from. You can find Western-themed guns like heavy revolvers and pump shotguns with wooden stocks dropping from gang members around the old-timey city of Aquila. Ecliptic mercenaries that drop into combat encounters like to tote around advanced weapons that are already calibrated with mods and sights equipped. And each of the gun variants has its own cool and unique reload animation, which is super satisfying to watch. It's nice little touches like these that can really draw you into Starfield's world. And once again, we have to swing into the bad. The maps, the HUD, the inventory system. Almost everything about these. There are a lot of different types of maps because, well, they need to scale almost infinitely, from the entire known universe down to the ground level of a single landing area on a planet. Accessing these maps is a nuisance. You have to slowly swap between each view until you find the level that's relative to your current position. The only saving grace is that you can set your active quest and jump directly to where that fast travel point is, so you don't even have to deal with the map in the first place. Unless your destination lies outside of your ship's grav jump range, and then you get stuck ping-ponging to the closest system you visited and jumping again. And then there are the times when you have to explore by foot and actively find your destination. The surface maps are basically useless because they don't show any detail, just a grid of dots and markers for the major points of interest. And guess what? You can't set waypoints or tag the points of interest, which means you'll constantly be opening and closing your scanner to make sure you're on the right track. And the maps for major cities? Forget about them, they don't exist. Better get accustomed to reading street signs or aimlessly wandering pathways until you spot a recognizable landmark. Oh yeah, and I forgot to mention the little inconvenience you'll come across with a fast travel system. Don't worry, I haven't forgotten about you. Guess we need to tackle this beast of a subject. The inventory system itself isn't very offensive, not on the surface anyways. They've categorized all the items that you can collect into a few sections like your weapons, suit, helmet, resources, and miscellaneous objects. But basically, this is the same menu out of 12-year-old Skyrim with a new coat of paint. Some of those sections get absolutely clogged up because on top of being an RPG, they wanted Starfield to have crafting and survival game elements. What do you need to keep and what's okay to throw out? The item descriptions don't tell you what they can be used for in crafts. You just have to lug everything around until you can find one of the many types of workbenches. Ideally, you'd want to hold on to every little thing you can find, whether it be a useful resource or some kind of valuable trinket that you want to sell to a vendor. But you cannot carry everything. Hell, you can hardly carry some things because our old friend, the weight system, is here to ruin your fun. In a stroke of what I want to call genius, Bethesda decided to place extreme emphasis on how much things weigh. It trickles down into everything, from the fast travel system, to the skill tree, to the shipbuilding. And man, is it just the fucking worst. Your basic carrying capacity is anemic, like you can barely keep anything extra on your person. Now, you aren't completely immobile when you exceed your capacity, which is a good improvement over past titles, but you lose the ability to fast travel to your ship, and you run out of oxygen fast if you try to run. And I mean just normal running when the stick is tilted, not just sprinting. Now, I know what you're saying. Well, what about storage on your ship? Or your outposts? Yeah, you do get a bit of extra wiggle room to stash some stuff on your ship, but in order to get more room, you need to modify it with extra cargo holds, and that takes a lot of time, money, and levels, which you won't have until much later in the game. The same goes for outposts, but at least you can just drop items off in the buildings you make and come back for them later. Unless they start to sink into the floor. But if you aren't keeping your items in some kind of storage container at your outposts, and if you don't have certain facilities built yet, then you will have to fly back to your outpost every single time you want to grab your items. Which means lots and lots of loading screens. And remembering what you have in your own inventory, in your ship's inventory, in your followers' inventories, and your outposts is a chore in and of itself. The one decent solution I've found is Constellation's Lodge, where you have a room with a safe that has seemingly infinite storage capacity. But again, it isn't linked up with the other inventories for times when you're crafting or in need of specific items. You have to fast travel there, grab what you need, and then fast travel back to whatever you were doing in need of those materials. This is kind of bordering on gameplay, so let's switch gears. Originally, I'm sure that a lot of people were sold on Starfield being an exploration game, but that really isn't the case here. The only true exploring you'll be doing is in caves and abandoned facilities on planets, which you can see markers for from the orbit of a planet. There also aren't maps inside of any of these, and they can quickly turn into mazes. While you're on your ship, literally everything is handled through the fast travel system. You can't fly yourself from solar system to solar system, or planet to planet, or even from the orbit of a planet down to its surface like you'd be able to do in a game like No Man's Sky. You just pick a spot to land on, or choose a marked location, press the button, and watch a short cinematic of the ship dropping from the sky. On planets, you can bring up the scanner, which you're going to use a lot to see what kinds of resources and animals are around. Some planets will have normal gravity, and some will have extra low gravity that lets you bounce around and spend lots of time airborne. Each planet also has its own type, temperature, and atmosphere that will affect you based on the strengths and weaknesses of your outfit. If there's constant freezing rain and you don't have shelter, you could catch hypothermia or get frostbite, which will negatively impact your character in some way. Or if you step through the natural gases flowing up through the surface, you can develop lung damage and a heavy cough. You'll either have to use medical remedies that you found, or visit a doctor to cure yourself of these ailments. Again, it's very survival gamey in this aspect. Personally, I'm not a survival game fan, so you can probably imagine how I feel micromanaging my character's many health detriments. I will give Bethesda this, it is impressive how the game keeps track of everything going on with the environments, and I know a lot of people love little simulated elements like these. But to me, they just serve to make the gameplay loop more tedious and annoying. It doesn't really add any value to my experience, it just means I need to waste more time opening my bag to apply the right curative, or running to my outpost to craft more bandages and injectors. Make no mistake, this game is an RPG first and a shooter second. The gunplay is functional, with some interesting weapon types that might change up how you operate, though having 30 FPS on console certainly doesn't help. The mobility and the gun handling won't win any competitions with full-on shooters like Call of Duty, Destiny, or Apex Legends either, so it's best to temper your expectations. It feels a bit like a less clunky version of Fallout with the same slippery aim assist, but they also held over something that I absolutely can't stand in shooters: the accuracy stat. Your crosshairs can be lined up directly over someone's head, and the bullets will veer off course for no reason other than the game deciding that you don't deserve to hit your shots. I hate it. This game doesn't have the VAT system from Fallout. If you have to, nerf the amount of damage that guns do at longer ranges or something, but please leave the way that the accuracy stat currently works in the past where it belongs. I guess they wanted to give the combatant AI some kind of leg up on the players, since AI is practically brain dead on normal difficulty. The only time I've ever actually felt threatened by an enemy is when they're rushing me with melee attacks, or they're like 20 levels higher than me where one bullet drops 3/4 of my health. You can also have one of the many companions follow you around on your journeys into the unknown who help you in combat. Most of them are members of Constellation, but they're not very distinct. Almost none of them are fun to hang out with besides the chaotic neutral robot pal Vasco and Andreja, who seems morally gray with a mysterious past. The game really talks up Barrett as this Han Solo-esque scoundrel who's always getting into trouble, but really he's just kind of lucky and lame. The same goes for Sarah, who acts like the captain of the fun police. And don't get me started on the constant nagging about picking up things that you don't need. But as far as I can tell, they're practically immortal in a fight. If only their personalities were as strong as their will to live, this game could be awesome. The writing for the characters isn't fantastic, and the same goes for most of the missions and side activities. Everywhere you go where people are around, you'll hear chattering in the background, and the game will give you a big pop-up in the upper left corner when you overhear something that's related to a side quest. Sometimes it feels like natural dialogue between a couple of NPCs, and other times it's super random. Like, you'll walk past someone standing there alone, and they'll just start rambling openly about important personal matters in front of you, a stranger. It's like they couldn't find a better way to deliver that information besides punching you in the face until you react. Now, some of the better stories the game has to offer come from the faction quests. You can join any faction in your playthrough, and even though they might be at odds with one another, I'm pretty sure there are ways to stay in all of the factions at the same time. I haven't finished any of the faction quest lines yet, but I picked up most of them and got at least halfway through their respective stories. I don't want to spoil anything here, but if the main story isn't doing much for you, I would encourage you to at least start one of these instead and see where it takes you. Since we were on the subject of characters, let's talk about the skill tree. When you start the game, you have to choose a background for your own character along with a few fun traits. There are lots of interesting sounding backgrounds to choose from that you wouldn't see in any other game like Sculptor or Long Hauler, but they never really amount to anything or affect your gameplay. The only thing that really matters is the 3 skill points associated with them. The skill tree itself is massive, with 5 main branches, and each skill can be ranked up to 4 times for greater effect. There's 82 skills, which means there's a total of 328 skill points you can earn and allocate. And yes, you can eventually unlock them all once you played enough to get all of the levels. But not all of these skills were created equally, and some of the choices made in the way they built the skill tree are utterly confusing. Many of the skills lock off sections of the game as a binary have or have not option. For example, if you want to use a booster pack, one of the core gameplay mechanics, you need to have a point in the booster pack skill. Your character can't just wear a booster pack and be bad at controlling it, you literally aren't allowed to use one. Which is wild, since they literally give you a free one in the opening of the main mission. The same goes for stealth, where you don't unlock a stealth meter without it, or the ability to attempt pickpocketing without the theft skill. You can't even use your ship's boosters without the piloting skill. Holding basic functionality of the game behind an arbitrary wall of time spent playing is insanely dumb. I'm 45 hours in and I'm done with the story, and I'm still unable to do some of the most simple things you can think of. There are also skills besides these needed ones that feel mandatory for a fun experience. Remember this guy? Well, if you want to increase your carrying capacity, there's the weightlifting skill, which you can only rank up by running around with your inventory 75% full for several hours. Then there's the targeting control systems perk that allows you to slow down time and pick which part of an enemy ship that you're aiming at to break first. And hey, I guess that's where VATS went. You can only board and hijack a ship by blowing up their engines, so you won't be doing any pirating in space without it. Since we're on the topic of ships, what are you doing while you're in space anyways? You're certainly not flying anywhere since it's all locked to fast traveling, but when you eventually drop out of your hyperspace cutscene, you might have a random encounter in orbit. There's a few types of scenarios that can play out, and most of the time it'll be a friendly ship hailing you, giving you advice, or warning you about nearby danger. Sometimes you'll find a derelict ship full of looters or wild creatures, but I'd say about 40 to 50% of the time, you bump into an enemy faction who wants you dead. Those of you whose fantasy involves dogfighting in space are probably locked in and ready to go. You've got multiple munition types at your disposal, and you can adjust how much power gets routed to each system on your ship. You can prioritize your weapons and shields, or max out the engine to move quickly out of their line of sight. Or you could just dump it all into the grav drive and run away to another system. Anything goes. Again, skills come into play here, and points further invested into piloting will give you better maneuverability in a fight. You could also grab the ballistic weapon system skill for more damage, or one of the many others that add to your firepower or shields. The ship combat is pretty fun, but it takes a while to build a better ship and get used to the controls, especially rerouting power to the different systems in real time with the D-pad. You really want to pump up your engines and shields to get behind enemy vessels before pushing all of your energy into weapons, and it gets very tricky when you're fighting against more than one ship. Something you'll learn very fast is that the first ship you get, the Frontier, is very basic. It's a jack of all trades that isn't very good at any certain thing. You can buy new ships at kiosks in the major city ports, or build them yourself with parts that you buy or take off stolen ships. I feel like being able to see the ships that you can buy sitting in a shipyard where you could walk around them and examine their details before paying for them would have been a cooler experience than walking up to what's essentially a vending machine. But I guess they figured that it wouldn't be worth the development cost since most people opt to steal or build their own. Shipbuilding is more than a little bit confusing when you start, and they only let you know that you can build one if you visit one of those kiosks. That speaks to one of the game's biggest problems, the lack of any kind of tutorialization. If you weren't hooked into all the material that Bethesda put out in videos and newsletters before launch, you would not be aware of most of the systems in the game until you happen to stumble into them. Simple things like how to favorite weapons and put them in the weapon wheels, suit and weapon customization, how to equip throwable items like grenades, where to buy and sell things just go completely unexplained. I feel like I've spent more time looking at the pause screen and using my phone to Google things than I have actually spent playing the game. You probably wouldn't know that certain kinds of items are considered contraband either, and even though I mentioned them earlier, I wanted to wait until now to talk about them. Whenever you enter orbit of a faction-controlled planet, they scan your cargo for contraband items which are deemed illegal. And if you happen to pick up an item with this little indecipherable symbol, whoopsie, off to jail you go. Of course, you probably noticed that they sell for a crazy high price, which is nice, but who buys them? What do you do with them when you want to travel to a settlement besides throwing them out? It turns out that you can acquire cargo holds for your ship that obscure your cargo, and jammers to prevent the scans from picking them up, which would have been nice to know before getting 20 hours in. On a completely unrelated note, audio. Something that always makes up for other less than stellar aspects of a game is a really great soundtrack, and Starfield gets high marks for this one. Edon Zur has returned once again to give us a smattering of vibrant ambient space-themed melodies. The songs are hopeful and full of mystique, and always leave the impression that there's more out there beyond your reach, just waiting to be discovered. The voice work and some of the other things going on with the audio leave a bit to be desired. To be clear, not all of the dialogue is bad, and I do not blame the voice actors for everything. But there are extremely weird and fake accents galore, and the tone for most of the conversations with characters reads like they're scared to commit to any kind of emotion. A lot of this rests on the weak script and a lack of proper direction for the actors. The writing through most of the game feels stilted and completely disingenuous. For example, with some minor spoilers for the main story, there's a moment when you have to go meet with a man who's selling an artifact. It becomes very obvious that he stole it from someone else to make quick cash and to get off the planet. Well, that person has some employees hunting down the artifact and the thief, and since you now have the artifact, you'll probably end up killing some of their men. When you make it to the original owner's office, they have the thief captured, but they decide that you, the guy who just mowed down 30 of their men, should be the one to choose what happens to the thief. And if you just let him escape safely, nothing happens. The artifact's original owner just carries on like nothing happened. There's no repercussions for your choice at all. To wrap things up, there are a couple of more subjects that are hard to talk about without spoiling more stuff. I'm not going to go in depth with these, but they're worth mentioning. The first is the addition of certain abilities you can get which are neat, and the second is New Game Plus. There's a lot of conversation about what New Game Plus means in Starfield. Some people will tell you to rush the main story as fast as possible, and there are some interesting things that come with playing the game that way. Some stuff carries over from your original save, and other stuff does not. If you don't like the idea of losing progress, you might be best off progressing the main story and getting to New Game Plus as early as possible to see what happens, but that's also not a very fun way to play for a lot of people. If you want the most balanced experience, and plan to play this game for a very, very long time anyways, you'll probably have more fun just playing at your own pace and getting into New Game Plus when you're ready. I know it sounds like I'm talking in riddles, sorry, but it's complicated. Even Pete Hines, the head of Bethesda, couldn't explain it, saying that Starfield doesn't even really get going until you finish the main quest. My thoughts are that maybe you shouldn't need to dig 30 to 40 hours into a game and beat it to find the good part in a second playthrough. In conclusion, Starfield is a game about the future that, to me, feels like it's still stuck in the past. If you go into this game expecting nothing more than a Bethesda-ass Bethesda game, you'll probably have a great time. You can make your own fun with emergent gameplay and the things the game gives you, and you can try to live out the story that you want to build for your character. But if you're like me, who really hoped from the bottom of my heart that Bethesda were capable of crafting an experience that truly lives up to the potential that a spacefaring sci-fi adventure can offer, feel free to seek that fantasy elsewhere. Starfield can be boiled down to the sum of its parts by looking at any game Bethesda has released on the last 2 generations of consoles. The bones and blood of this game are constructed from a tired, formulaic need to iterate rather than innovate. In my eyes, Starfield isn't a giant leap for mankind. It's a disappointingly small baby step in a direction that I've lost interest in. Starfield receives a 6.5 out of 10.